1st of January. A new year, a fresh start. For most, it was a night of celebration. Fireworks lit up the sky, glasses clinked, and promises of change filled the air. But on a quiet street in Athens, Alabama, the only sound that mattered wasn't laughter or midnight toasts. It was the crack of gunfire. 5 shots. A mother collapsed onto the pavement, her lifeblood seeping into the cold concrete. Her 8-month-old daughter clutched in her arms, a final instinctive act of protection. A 3-year-old, too young to understand, hid beneath a car, watching the world she knew shatter before her eyes. Just feet away, police officers stood frozen, helpless to stop what had unfolded in front of them. The man holding the gun had been out of prison for only 10 days. 10 days. That was all it took. The woman lying in that driveway was Alexis Garth, 26 years old, a mother, a daughter, a fighter, and now a name in the headlines. She had seen this moment coming. She had tried to escape. She had made plans, whispered in careful tones, moved in cautious steps. But she ran out of time. The man who pulled the trigger had warned her. He had promised this ending. And the system, the very one meant to protect her, had let him walk free to carry it out.
Limestone County, where one person is dead and another is behind bars, arrested and charged with capital murder following a shooting early this morning. WAFF 48's Ky'ruan Lee joins us live in Athens in front of the home where police officers say today's shooting happened. Ky'ruan, you've learned a woman was killed in what police are now calling a domestic dispute.
Nolan, I've been outside talking to neighbors all day about this early morning shooting, including one man who says that he noticed erratic driving from the people that were in the house behind me. Now, if you take a look at your screen, you can see the mugshot of 20-year-old Ky'ruan Yarbrough, who was arrested early this morning. He's charged with capital murder for shooting and killing 26-year-old Alexis Garth. At 4 o'clock this morning, Athens police officers responded to a domestic violence shooting call where I am on 22,000 block of Oakdale Ridge Lane. When officers arrived, they say they found Garth in the driveway. She was taken to Huntsville Hospital where she later died of her injuries. I talked to a man who was at the home next door and detailed his reaction when the shooting happened.
Went back to poke my head back outside to see what was going on, and I heard 3 gunshots, so I shut the door, locked it, and then within, I don't know, 2 or 3 minutes, there was already cop cars here, so I didn't know exactly what happened. I thought maybe there was a robbery going on, but I don't think so after, reading a bunch of stuff.
Athens police tells us this is still an active investigation. As we continue to learn new details about what happened this morning, we'll update you on air and online. Reporting live in Athens, Ky'ruan Lee, 48 on your side.
The questions that followed were the same ones asked too many times before. Why wasn't he stopped? How did no one see this coming? How many more will there be? But for 2 little girls, there were no questions, no explanations, no second chances, just silence. The kind that stretches long after the sirens fade. This isn't just another crime story. This is the price of a system that fails, a life stolen, a future erased, and a lesson learned far too late. This is the story of Alexis Garth and how the system failed her. For Alexis Garth, life had never been handed to her. She built it, piece by piece, moment by moment, never waiting for the world to offer her anything she wasn't willing to fight for. In Athens, Alabama, Alexis grew up with a fire inside her. She wasn't the type to settle or let circumstances define her. She had dreams, big ones, a future in healthcare, a home to call her own, a life where her daughters, 3-year-old Alani and 8-month-old Kamani, would know nothing but love, security, and the warmth of their mother's unwavering presence. She had done everything right. She had worked, she had studied, she had fought her way into independence. By 26, she wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, a new home, a bright future, a life that was supposed to be hers to live. But freedom is a fragile thing, and sometimes the most dangerous moment in a person's life isn't when they're trapped, it's when they try to break free. Because Alexis had been planning to leave. She had been careful, moving in silence, making plans that few knew about. She had confided in her sister, Miracle Scott, dropping hints about the future she was working toward, a future without Ky'ruan Yarbrough, the man who, in just 10 days, would destroy everything. When Alexis first met Yarbrough, it wasn't the nightmare it would become. It never is. He wasn't just a man with a violent past. He was someone who could be charming when it suited him, someone who knew how to make a woman believe she was safe before he reminded her that she wasn't. At just 20 years old, Yarbrough had already left a trail of destruction behind him, a criminal history dating back to his teenage years, a pattern of escalating violence that the justice system had seen and ignored. In 2019, at only 16, he made his intentions clear to the world. After a petty dispute, he pulled out a gun and fired at 3 juveniles, hitting 2. It was an act that should have sealed his fate, a red flag so bright it couldn't be missed. But the system saw him as something else, a youthful offender. Instead of a real sentence, he got a slap on the wrist, probation, a second chance, the kind of leniency that is never afforded to the people who end up on the other side of the gun. That was his first warning, but it wouldn't be the last. He violated probation again and again. The court finally sent him to prison, but even that wouldn't last. On December 22, 2022, just weeks before Alexis took her last breath, he walked free under Alabama's mandatory release program. It didn't matter that he had a history of violence, that he had shown the world exactly who he was, that he had no intention of changing. He was released, and 10 days later, Alexis was dead. The thing about stories like this is that they don't happen in isolation. They don't come out of nowhere. There were signs. Alexis's social media had been a place of joy once. Updates about her kids, pictures of milestones, the kind of moments that made up the life she was building. But then, slowly, things started to change. Her presence dimmed. The bright, confident woman she had always been started to hesitate. Friends noticed first, calls became shorter, conversations felt guarded, she wasn't laughing as much, she wasn't showing up the way she used to. Her sisters saw it too. Miracle Scott would later say that Alexis had become careful, always checking over her shoulder, always thinking before she spoke. And Yarbrough? He was always watching, always listening. Even when he was behind bars, he found ways to remind her that he was still in control. He had people check on her, drive by the house, ask questions. And then there were the words, the ones Alexis would whisper to those she trusted. "I'm going to leave, I just have to be careful." She was setting things aside, making plans, preparing to disappear before he could realize what was happening. But what she didn't know, what so many victims don't know, is that the moment you decide to leave is often the moment you are in the most danger. Because men like Ky'ruan Yarbrough don't let go, they don't allow freedom. And Alexis was running out of time. The last weeks of Alexis's life were a countdown that no one saw in time. She had started to rebuild old connections, reaching out to friends she had been isolated from. She had spoken to family about staying somewhere else. Her mother noticed small things, clothes being moved, documents being tucked away, like pieces of a plan she wasn't ready to say out loud. But Yarbrough knew. He had always known. On New Year's Eve 2022, as the world celebrated fresh starts, Alexis was caught in a storm she couldn't escape. Hours later, as the clock ticked past 4 a.m. on January 1, 2023, the streets of Athens, Alabama fell silent again, until the gunfire started. The streets were dark. The new year had only just begun, but for Alexis Garth, there would be no fresh start, no resolutions, no second chances. Just after 4 a.m., the sound of barking dogs shattered the early morning quiet on Oakdale Ridge Lane. The wind carried whispers of unease through the neighborhood, but the real storm had already begun inside Alexis's home. She stood in the driveway, her heartbeat racing, her arms wrapped tightly around her 8-month-old daughter, Kimani. Nearby, her 3-year-old Alani had found a hiding place beneath a car, pressing herself into the cold concrete, small enough to disappear into the shadows. A voice so sharp and urgent cut through the night. "Get behind the car, get behind the car." Then came the gunfire. 5 shots. Each one a final answer to a question Alexis had already asked herself too many times. Would he ever let her go? She hit the ground. Blood spread beneath her, a silent witness to what had just unfolded. But in those last moments, her instincts never failed her. Her arms had still been wrapped around Kimani, shielding her even as her own life slipped away. The officers who had arrived at the scene stood frozen. They had witnessed it all, too late to stop it, too late to change the outcome. The man who had pulled the trigger stood just feet away, the weapon still warm in his hands. Ky'ruan Yarbrough didn't run, he didn't have to, because Alexis had always known how this would end. How does a man like Ky'ruan Yarbrough, someone with a history of violence, someone who had already shot 2 people before, walk free just days before committing murder? How does a justice system look at a man like him and decide he deserves another chance, while a woman like Alexis never got one? The answers to those questions lie buried in paperwork, in policies designed to prioritize second chances over second victims. At 16, Yarbrough had already proven what he was capable of: a gunfight, 2 injured teenagers, a court that labeled him a youthful offender instead of a violent threat. Probation followed, a chance to rehabilitate, a chance to prove that his past wouldn't define his future. But his future was already written, because it wasn't long before he violated that probation. Again, and again, and again. By the time the court finally sent him to prison, it wasn't because he had learned his lesson. It was because they had run out of excuses. 36 months, that was his sentence, but he didn't serve all of it. On December 22, 2022, just 10 days before Alexis's murder, the Alabama Department of Corrections made a decision that would cost her life. They released him early. A mandatory release, a policy meant to reduce prison overcrowding, to offer inmates a supervised transition back into society. But what happens when that society is forced to take back a man who was never supposed to be free? Who was watching him? Who was making sure he wouldn't go back to the same patterns? Who was protecting Alexis? The answer was simple. No one. And the price of that failure would be paid in blood. As the first day of 2023 began, Alexis Garth was dying in her own driveway. She had been rushed to Huntsville Hospital, but the damage was done. The bullets had torn through her, sealing her fate before she even arrived. She had fought for a future, but she wouldn't live to see it. Her family would later say that Alexis wasn't just another statistic. She wasn't just a victim of domestic violence. She was a mother, a sister, a daughter. Someone who had dreams that extended far beyond the man who took her life. But dreams don't protect you from a system that refuses to see the danger until it's too late. Her 3-year-old daughter understood enough to know that something was wrong. She knew her mother had been taken away, knew she wasn't coming back. But how does a child comprehend something so final? My mommy died. My mommy's asleep at the hospital forever. Those were the words of a toddler who would grow up in a world without her mother's laughter, without her mother's protection, without the warmth of the only person who had ever loved her unconditionally. Because in the end, that's what this story is really about. Not just a murder, not just a crime, but 2 little girls who will wake up every day without the mother who fought for them until her very last breath. And a justice system that will never have to answer for the life it fails to save. The weight of grief is something that never truly fades. It lingers in the silence of an empty room, in the laughter that never comes, in the spaces where a loved one once stood. For Alexis Garth's family, the loss was unbearable. A daughter stolen, a sister ripped away, 2 little girls left with nothing but memories too fragile to hold on to. Her mother, Shanetta Garth, would later say that Alexis was the one who first gave her purpose, and now that purpose had been taken from her in the cruelest way imaginable. Her sister, Miracle Scott, had spoken to Alexis just 1 hour before the shooting. 1 hour. That was all it took for life to shift from normal to irreversible devastation. She had known Alexis wanted to leave. She had known the situation was dangerous, but knowing isn't the same as expecting, because no one ever truly believes they're about to lose someone until they do. The chaos on Oakdale Ridge Lane didn't end with the final gunshot. It was only the beginning. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, their quiet homes suddenly surrounded by flashing police lights. Some had been startled awake by the noise. Others had heard the commotion before the shots ever rang out. Rock Suggs, a neighbor house sitting nearby, would later recall the moment that sent a chill down his spine. I'd heard voices yelling, "Get behind the car! Get behind the car!" Then a few minutes later, sirens. When he finally stepped outside, the scene was already set. A man in handcuffs, a mother bleeding in the driveway, a grandmother screaming in anguish. Another neighbor, Kathy Wells, who worked for Crisis Services of North Alabama, would later say that she wished she had known Alexis was in trouble. Had I seen the police here before, I would have let her know that there's help out there. But domestic violence is often a crime that hides in plain sight. The bruises aren't always visible. The scars aren't always the kind you can see. And far too often, victims suffer in silence. Until that silence is broken by a final act of violence. By the time officers secured the scene, the damage had already been done. They arrested Ky'ruan Yarbrough without resistance. There was no fight, no attempt to flee, because the reality was, he didn't have to. In his mind, the job was already finished. Within days, Yarbrough appeared in court for a pre-trial detention hearing under Anaya's law, a law designed to deny bond to violent offenders, preventing them from walking free before trial. This time, the system acted. The judge ordered him to be held without bond. But what difference did it make? Because Alexis wasn't there to see justice. And for her family, no courtroom, no sentencing, no legal proceedings could undo what had already been done. Her sister, Miracle Scott, would later say the words that have haunted so many families before her. You took the mother of your child, my sister, someone else's daughter. You could have just let her leave. Let her leave. It sounds so simple, but for women trapped in the cycle of domestic violence, walking away is often the most dangerous thing they can do. So how many more? How many more women will make plans to escape only to never get the chance? How many more abusers will be handed a second chance while their victims are given none? How many more families will wake up to the nightmare Alexis's family now lives every single day? The news of Alexis's murder spread fast. A young mother, a life full of promise, a story that should have had a different ending. Her funeral was held at Reynolds Funeral Home on January 8, 2023. The next day, the Round Island Creek Mission Center overflowed with mourners. People who had loved her, people who had known her, people who simply could not believe she was gone. She had been more than just a headline. She had been someone. But in the days that followed, the world kept turning. The news cycle moved on. Another tragedy took its place, and for many, Alexis's story became just another case, just another statistic. But not for her family. Not for the two little girls who would never hear their mother's voice again. Not for the people who knew that this should have never happened. This wasn't random, it wasn't an accident, it was a failure, one that cost a woman her life. Alexis Garth had done everything she was supposed to do. She had built a life for herself. She had loved her children fiercely. She had seen the danger and made plans to escape. But none of it mattered. Because when the system ignores warning signs, when it releases violent offenders back into the world unchecked, when it waits until after a murder to finally take action, the outcome is already decided. It was decided the moment Ky'ruan Yarbrough walked free. It was decided the moment Alexis had to look over her shoulder. It was decided the moment the justice system failed to do the one thing it was supposed to do, protect her. The truth is, there are thousands of Alexis Garths out there. Women living in fear, women making quiet escape plans, women hoping that maybe, just maybe, they'll be one of the lucky ones who get away. But hope isn't enough. Hope doesn't stop a bullet. Hope doesn't protect a mother standing in her own driveway. Hope doesn't raise two little girls left behind in the wake of violence. So what will? And how many more lives will be lost before we finally figure it out? The weight of tragedy doesn't just settle in the hearts of those who loved Alexis. It seeps into the cracks of a broken system, exposing every failure, every missed warning, every opportunity to stop this before it happened. Her family buried her, her daughters were left without a mother, and the man responsible, he sat behind bars, awaiting a trial that would never bring Alexis back. But this story isn't just about a single crime, it's about the pattern that led to it, the chain of events that allowed it to unfold, and the questions that still demand answers. Because Alexis Garth should still be here. The decision to release Ky'ruan Yarbrough wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't an oversight, it was policy. In Alabama, the mandatory release program was designed to transition inmates back into society, allowing for early release under supervision. On paper, it sounds reasonable, a way to prevent overcrowding, a way to reintegrate offenders with oversight. But what happens when the people being released aren't ready for freedom? What happens when those supervised individuals walk straight back into the lives of the people they once terrorized? What happened to Alexis answers that question in blood. Authorities had a chance to stop him. They had seen his history, his violent outbursts, his complete disregard for consequences. They knew he had fired a gun before. They knew he had nearly killed before. And yet, on December 22, 2022, they let him go. Less than 2 weeks later, Alexis was dead. So who answers for that? Who takes responsibility for the decision that placed a loaded gun back in the hands of a man who had already shown he was willing to use it? The reality is no one will. Because when the system fails, the weight of that failure doesn't fall on the people who made the decisions, it falls on the victims, the ones who don't get another chance, the ones who don't get a second shot at life. And now Alexis's name is added to the growing list of women who were failed before they were killed. People will ask why Alexis didn't leave sooner, why she didn't run the first time she saw the signs. But those people don't understand what it means to be trapped. Leaving an abusive relationship isn't as simple as packing a bag and walking away, because abusers don't just control their victims physically, they control them mentally, emotionally, financially. They break them down piece by piece until there's nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no way out that doesn't feel like a death sentence. For Alexis, the danger wasn't just in staying, it was in leaving, because statistics show that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they try to escape. The threats become real, the violence escalates, and too often it ends exactly the way it did for Alexis, in bloodshed. She had been careful, she had made plans, she had taken quiet steps toward freedom. But it wasn't enough. And that's the part of the story people need to understand. Women like Alexis don't stay because they want to. They stay because the world has made it nearly impossible to leave safely. And when they finally do, that's when their abusers decide that if they can't have them, no one can. Alexis Garth didn't get to choose how her story ended. But her family refuses to let her name fade into another statistic. Her mother, lled Garth, is turning her grief into action. She has taken over Alexis's dreams of entrepreneurship, using AOK Boutique not just as a business, but as a living tribute to the daughter she lost. Every sale, every decision, every moment spent growing the business is a reminder that Alexis had plans that should have been fulfilled by her, not in her memory. Her sister, Miracle Scott, is speaking out. She is making sure Alexis's story is told, making sure people understand what happened, making sure that the next woman who sees the warning signs doesn't feel like she has to face them alone. But the truth is, no amount of advocacy, no amount of awareness, no amount of systemic change will bring Alexis back. 2 little girls are growing up without a mother. A family is waking up every day with a hole in their lives that will never be filled. And a justice system that should have protected her is still standing, unchanged, unshaken, moving forward as if Alexis Garth never existed at all. So what happens now? What happens to the next woman in her position? What happens when another man with a history of violence is handed another second chance? What happens when another family watches their daughter, their sister, their mother become the next name on a long, endless list? Because this story isn't over. It's happening right now. Somewhere another Alexis is making plans, whispering about leaving, hiding away money, searching for a way out. And if nothing changes, if we don't ask the hard questions, demand the right answers, then we already know how her story will end. Just like this one, the weight of tragedy doesn't just settle in the hearts of those who loved Alexis, it seeps into the cracks of a broken system, exposing every failure, every missed warning, every opportunity to stop this before it happened. Her family buried her. Her daughters were left without a mother, and the man responsible? He sat behind bars awaiting a trial that would never bring Alexis back. But this story isn't just about a single crime. It's about the pattern that led to it, the chain of events that allowed it to unfold, and the questions that still demand answers. Because Alexis Garth should still be here. The decision to release Ky'ruan Yarbrough wasn't a clerical error. It wasn't an oversight, it was policy. In Alabama, the mandatory release program was designed to transition inmates back into society, allowing for early release under supervision. On paper, it sounds reasonable, a way to prevent overcrowding, a way to reintegrate offenders with oversight. But what happens when the people being released aren't ready for freedom? What happens when those supervised individuals walk straight back into the lives of the people they once terrorized? What happened to Alexis answers that question in blood. Authorities had a chance to stop him. They had seen his history, his violent outbursts, his complete disregard for consequences. They knew he had fired a gun before. They knew he had nearly killed before. And yet, on December 22, 2022, they let him go. Less than 2 weeks later, Alexis was dead. So who answers for that? Who takes responsibility for the decision that placed a loaded gun back in the hands of a man who had already shown he was willing to use it? The reality is, no one will. Because when the system fails, the weight of that failure doesn't fall on the people who made the decisions. It falls on the victims, the ones who don't get another chance, the ones who don't get a second shot at life. And now Alexis's name is added to the growing list of women who were failed before they were killed. People will ask why Alexis didn't leave sooner, why she didn't run the first time she saw the signs. But those people don't understand what it means to be trapped. Leaving an abusive relationship isn't as simple as packing a bag and walking away, because abusers don't just control their victims physically, they control them mentally, emotionally, financially. They break them down piece by piece until there's nowhere to go, no one to turn to, no way out that doesn't feel like a death sentence. For Alexis, the danger wasn't just in staying, it was in leaving, because statistics show that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic violence is when they try to escape. The threats become real, the violence escalates, and too often it ends exactly the way it did for Alexis, in bloodshed. She had been careful, she had made plans, she had taken quiet steps toward freedom. But it wasn't enough. And that's the part of the story people need to understand. Women like Alexis don't stay because they want to, they stay because the world has made it nearly impossible to leave safely. And when they finally do, that's when their abusers decide that if they can't have them, no one can. Alexis Garth didn't get to choose how her story ended, but her family refuses to let her name fade into another statistic. Her mother, Shanetta Garth, is turning her grief into action. She has taken Alexis' dream and made it her own, turning Aha OK Boutique into a living tribute, a symbol of the future Alexis should have had. Her sister, Miracle Scott, has stepped into the role of advocate, speaking out against domestic violence, sharing Alexis' story, and making sure that other women recognize the signs before it's too late. But their efforts, their heartbreak, their loss, it shouldn't take tragedy to start these conversations. The justice system failed Alexis, and it's failing countless women just like her. Because abusers don't wake up one day and decide to kill. They follow a pattern, they escalate, they test how much they can get away with until the final, irreversible act. And when that moment comes, society stands by, shaking its head, saying, if only we had known. But we do know. We've always known. And until we stop pretending this is just another crime story, until we start treating domestic violence as the crisis that it is, until the justice system stops handing second chances to men like Yarbrough, while women like Alexis never get one, this will happen again, and again, and again, until another mother stands in her driveway trying to protect her children, until another little girl hides beneath a car, listening to the sound of gunfire, until another family is left to pick up the pieces. So what happens now? Do we wait for the next Alexis? Or do we finally decide that enough is enough? If this story moved you, if you believe Alexis's life mattered, help us spread awareness. Share this video, you never know who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below, your voice matters in this conversation. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications to stay informed about the stories that must be told. Every share, every comment, every subscription helps shine a light on the people who need it the most. We don't just tell these stories, we fight for those who can no longer speak for themselves.